Hello there, I'm Rob Hart. I'm part of the Workforce Solutions team here for Allegis Global Solutions in EMEA. I'm really excited to be joined by Jonathan Winters, who's our Procurement Solutions Executive for Allegis Global Solutions in EMEA as well, to recap a recent workshop that we hosted in ProcureCon at their conference in Barcelona. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey Rob, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, mate. So ProcureCon brought together 330 procurement professionals from a mixture of different industries and areas of interest. It was lovely to see so many people in person after so long away, and we had some really inspirational keynote speakers as well. We had the privilege of hosting a workshop entitled Solving the Global Workforce Crisis, and that ended up in being a really engaging conversation and brought up some really interesting questions. So, Jonathan, could you explain a little bit more about the topic we were discussing?
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about the extended workforce, which is a term that we use to refer to that wider non-permanent workforce. So on one end of that spectrum, you would have the contingent workers, so somebody who's in your team to cover some long-term absence with a job title and a day rate. And at the other end of that spectrum, you would have consultants under statements of work. So that could be you brought in Deloitte to help you comply with some new regulations. It's that wider spectrum is what we call the extended workforce, and we focus particularly on two areas the other week within that. One was triage, which is figuring out which of those two routes is the best route for me to take to get a piece of work done. And then the second is about trying to extract value from almost that overlap between the two. So projects that could be staffed with contingent workers or could equally be solutioned with a service provider.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. So we also know that peer-to-peer discussions are really highly valued by procurement professionals, and I think they're always one of the most popular parts of any conference that we go to. So we're really happy that we provided that environment for the people who attended. What were your main takeaways from that discussion, Jonathan?
I think there were a few from the roundtable that I was on. So one is pretty consistent with not only this event, but events we've been to over the past couple of years, which is people still struggle with process compliance. It doesn't matter how good your process is, how great it is extracting value from your supply base, any RFPs you run, anything like that. If you've still only got half your spend flowing through the program, then you've got some pretty major issues to address. That was one. In addition to that, most people still consider it to be a very high percentage of really just contingent workers hiding under SOWs. I asked the question to the table, if you were to estimate how many of your SOWs are really just T&M based contracts, a list of job titles and day rates, the table felt around that 60-70% of their SOWs would have been that. And that's starting to be seen by these people as a risk. A risk because they have programs set up to manage the contingent workforce from a regulatory perspective, a tax perspective, a legal perspective. And yet, by having these contingent workers housed in statements of work, they're carrying that risk without addressing it in the same way. We moved on from that to talk about institutional barriers that have driven people to contract in that way, to contract contingent workers under SOWs. These tended to be things like organizations who have a definition of one FTE is one contingent worker, but you could have, say, 10 consultants under a statement of work, and that would be no FTE. Or you could use consultancy budget for consultants, but not contingents, and vice versa. And then the last two topics we covered off were that the procurement teams still need to do a better job of aligning themselves to the goals and the objectives of the business unit, rather than trying to sort of push their own objectives onto the business unit. So we've still not got enough procurement teams going out to their business units talking about helping them grow, helping them enter new markets, helping them launch new products. There's still a strong message of procurement going out and talking about winning more of these, reducing cost, and that's just not going to align. Depending on the messaging within your business at the time, it's not going to align with their objectives, and therefore you're not going to get the buy-in. And then the final one was that really very few companies today can confidently talk about how successful their statements of work have been. So when we talk about this, we tend to talk about there being four key questions that you ought to be able to answer for every statement of work. Did the vendor do what it was supposed to do, which is the deliverables of the contract? Did they do it to the standard that was agreed, which is the acceptance criteria of the contract? Did it ultimately cost what the vendor said it would cost, and did it take the amount of time that they said it would take? And there's still a disproportionate number of procurement departments who would struggle to answer that question, and at the same time would also see the value in being able to answer that question for their business.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And I think it's probably worth pointing out, isn't it? I mean, the event was was really well attended. We actually split the workshop out into two different tables. And I think I echo a lot of what you said. I think from the people that we're in my group, but I think there was also a bit of a consensus that there were some underlying themes that maybe fueled some of the challenges in around managing that extended workforce. I think a lot of the conversation on my table was around some of the challenges in finding and attracting talent, and some of the processes within organisations that maybe made it easier to bring talent in through statement of work route than it would be through maybe a more formal or traditional MSP route. And the debate, I think, got fairly lively on my table, um, across those areas. But there was even a couple of people kind of mentioned that they were really getting into the weeds of who was actually delivering the work under a statement of work, even though they're aware it was supposed to be outcome driven, not people driven. But that did seem to highlight some of the wider kind of challenges across the marketplace that kind of people were feeling in terms of how they manage their wider extended workforce. So, do you have any advice or key messages for procurement professionals in building out a business case to escalate the conversation to C-level stakeholders to address some of the challenges that we found in the workshop, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like I mentioned earlier, is making sure that your messaging aligned with their objectives, not your objectives. So what is it your company's trying to do? What's your stated enterprise-wide strategy? Are you trying to enter new markets, increase your market share, launch new products? And if that's what you're trying to do, then the messaging should be about how procurement can act as a facilitator for that, how procurement can act as the bridge between the internal stakeholders and the external marketplace to facilitate this growth, this journey that the business is on. If you don't get that messaging right, you'll not really get the engagement. And just remember that it's only procurement who are procurement people, so avoid the procurement language, avoid talking about process and RFPs and any of this. Just talk about what you can do to facilitate an easier life for your stakeholders and what you can do to ensure that they get to meet their objectives.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And what do you think, given everything that we've heard at this conference and previously at CWS and really over the last kind of couple of years post-pandemic, what do you think the direction of travel is for organisations now as far as managing the extended workforces? Where do you think we're heading as far as SOW and procurement services spend is concerned?
Yeah, I think over time we'll stop addressing it in the same ways we do today. So today, what happens in most businesses is somewhere at the very beginning of the process, be it formally or informally, somebody makes a decision. I need to get some work done. Am I going to use contractors or am I going to use a service provider? And then once they've made that decision, they then look at that marketplace, find the best service provider or find the best contractors, get the work done, and everybody's happy. I think what that's done by making that decision at the very beginning of the process is it ruled you out of looking at half the marketplace. By looking just at the service providers, you've not looked at the staffing solution. By looking at the staffing solution, you've not looked at the service providers. So over time, I think what will happen is companies will start to move that decision-making point from the beginning of the process to somewhere a little bit further down. You'll still want to filter out the obvious, the stuff that's just definitely going to be a contingent worker or definitely a service provider. But for the rest, you're going to start to want to look at both marketplaces at the same time. And this was a topic we discussed in the session, that there should be some projects where there's no regulatory reason why it has to be one or the other. So you're far better off looking at both markets at once and seeing distinctly different ways of addressing the challenge that your business faces. Traditionally, you're looking at flavors of the same solution, but by looking at both marketplaces at once, you've got a deeper, more informed decision to make, and then engage in the same way and get the work done. So I think over time, that's going to be the biggest change. We'll start to see this as one continuum of non-permanent labour as opposed to two silos.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that kind of brings us to the close of the review. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining me today, and thank you very much for your insight. Allegis Global Solutions have recently published a book on what we think the future direction of travel is for workforce management. That's the Universal Workforce Model. It's a digital book. You can actually download it from a link provided at the end of this video, or please contact myself or Jonathan if you'd like a hard copy, and we'll be happy to send one across to you. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.